Well, I just want to give you an overview about the ACNC and our involvement with charities for a start, but particularly charities working overseas. So I mentioned those three objects: public trust and confidence, healthy, innovative, independent charities. We don't want to interfere with your means or methods. You know your mission best. And at the moment, there's about 100 new charities forming every week to fill gaps. Are there too many charities? Well, we take the view that it's up to boards of directors and committees to decide how they can most effectively fulfil their mission. But, and sometimes collaboration and mergers will be appropriate. But let a thousand flowers bloom when it comes to doing good in the world would be our view, apart from the registration team who are very tired by Friday. Cutting red tape. This came quite late in our brief when it was discussed in Parliament, but the deal was that if there was to be a regulator of charities requested by the sector, we should do all we possibly could to cut red tape and deal with the perhaps sometimes the scandals of you having to duplicate your work in every jurisdiction. And so we've been hustling around the jurisdictions to just simply say, can we identify where there is duplication? And can we work together to drive that out? Now, it's probably true to say that because of something of the uncertainty of our future, we have made slow progress. But that is now accelerating, and I hope we really will get some runs on the board in that area of cutting red tape. The elephant in the room at this stage is often, is the ACNC still here, and is it going to be here? Reading the tea leaves, seeing which way the wind is blowing, we think we should do a 5-year plan. There was a time when to iron 5 shirts on Sunday night was optimism when you worked at the ACNC. But we have now done our strategic planning for the next 3 years. And particularly the decision of the Senate last week saying, could we take the repeal bill off the table, that would give greater certainty, might give something of a sign that the ACNC will be around for a while. If we looked at the basics of what we do, we have a register, 55,000 charities, that are prepared to put in an annual information statement and prepared to be supervised and to meet some minimal governance standards. So this publicly accessible register, the first time in the history of Australia that we've been able to make that register available for anyone to look up, donors, members, even the organisation itself, to see if the information being put out to the public is accurate and up to date. So the register is at the heart of everything we do. The regulation, the compliance. If you get onto the register, you've indicated that you are a charity and that you're doing the right thing. And we want to make sure that the integrity of the register is such that when someone gets onto the register, they continue to do the right thing. And so our compliance team just want to make sure that if there are concerns expressed about a charity, whether we learn of those internally or by complaints externally, they're looked into. And that we keep people on track. I think the analogy of one of our charities on the register, the Royal Lifesavers, of swimming between the flags is helpful. If you swim outside the flags, we will not immediately drown you. We will try to blow the whistle and encourage you to come back between the flags. If, of course, you persist in swimming out there, we might ultimately take you off the register because that may indicate that you don't want to be there. And the way that we ensure that things are up to date is this reporting. The annual information statement, the first year, charities were telling us about 10 to 15 minutes was what it was taking. A bit more challenging in the second year, where the medium and large charities were providing their financials and the smaller charities were providing some data on their finances. But again, almost 40,000 charities have filed that second annual information statement. It allows us then to analyse the sector, understand the scope of the sector, what's really happening out there. We will not collect information that we do not give back to you if it's information that will help understand the sector and help researchers make the sector more effective. And so we make that information available, particularly to researchers, but also to the public. Our regulatory approach starts from honesty. But if there is something serious going on, take decisive action, because that's where public trust and confidence comes from. And I think the sector generally would say we really don't want bad apples in our barrel. That if this register is a register of dodgy charities, that's not good for anyone. And so we do want to deal with circumstances that is going to sully the register in a firm way where appropriate. So just a bit of statistics. For you, the top right-hand corner, registered charities, that was the clicker last night, 54,659. We started with about 60,000. About 9,000 of those are no longer on the register because they were missing in action. We couldn't find them. They didn't file 2 annual information statements. And this wasn't a sense of any sort of punishment. This was, again, the integrity of the register. But then we have been constantly adding new charities who have applied over that time. So each day, or at night if you can't sleep, turn up our clicker and see how many new charities are being registered. In the first year, we took a sample of around about 40,000 of the first annual information statements. We sent them to Curtin University to slice, dice and crunch the numbers. And they told us that the income of those charities about 100 billion. 44% of them relied on volunteers. The activities were interesting. 25% of the charities on our register, religious activities. Next in line was education. Next was grant making. Again, confirming the anecdotal evidence, 8% of Australia's workforce is employed in this sector. 919,000 people were employed in that first 40,000 registered charities. 5% of charities were 100 years old, and the average age of charities is 34, but still many new charities are being formed. When we came to examine charities that were operating overseas, there was a fairly surprising statistic. 15%. So we think of charities operating overseas perhaps traditionally as those under the Overseas Aid Deductibility Scheme, about 0.2% of the register. But what we discovered was there were lots of charities operating overseas, 15% of them, and the definition that we used there was, were you involved with communities overseas as a beneficiary? Was your main activity international activities? And if you operated overseas, we asked you to indicate your countries where you were operating. In terms of the size of charities operating overseas, it matched pretty much the profile that we had for charities generally. There were no anomalies for overseas operating charities and the whole list of charities. 68% of small, less than $250,000 are operating. 68% of the sample were small charities, 18% medium, 14% large, and that approximates the whole register as well. The charitable purposes were interesting. Advancement of religion. We might think of operating overseas as being aid and relief. No, the primary purpose was advancement of religion, relief of poverty, which is expected, and advancement of education. Perhaps that's not unexpected. And organisations didn't say, we're just involved in international stuff. They used words such as working with children, supporting people, development, community, health, providing aid. They're the sort of subjective views of what charities are really doing when operating overseas. They're getting into the granular, what exactly are we trying to achieve? The top activities undertaken overseas, religion, economic, social and community development, emergency relief, other education and social services is how charities regarded their work overseas, and the beneficiaries being communities generally, but children, young people, women and elderly people were target beneficiaries. This is an interesting list. This is the top 10 or 10 plus of countries in which charities are working. And just to give an indication, up near the top 5, about 4 or 5% of the charities operating overseas, India, Philippines, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia. Perhaps a surprising one is New Zealand. If you think about it, many communities, particularly in Queensland, have close links to New Zealand. So money and relationships flow between Australia and New Zealand in that way. Someone did say to me, why isn't Africa on the list? But I had to point out to them that Africa is not a country. Uganda and Kenya do feature. So 1.09 billion in grants going out Australia from this list of 40,000, 15% of them sending overseas. 2,242 charities provided that figure, but in reality, it's the big guys who are sending the big licks overseas. So it is the major organisations on our register who are involved overseas. The smaller ones are sending comparatively smaller licks of money. We want to provide as many resources as possible. This face-to-face meeting is part of those resources. Our advice line is another part of those resources. They promise they'll answer the phone within a very short time. How many minutes are we doing at the moment? This could be embarrassing. We've had a bad time, have we? But we really do want to make sure that when you ring up, you do get not a scripted answer, but actually a conversation on your query. But the publications here, the Charity Compliance Report, what happened in the first 2 years, and we've analysed not only what we've seen from the compliance experience, but what we intend to focus on in the future, including the activities of overseas charities. Protecting your charity from fraud, a very helpful document to discuss with your board to see if you've got the checks and balances in place. Governance for good, helpful discussion with your board as to basic governance principles. And then we also have a checklist to protect your charity from the risk of terrorism. And all the crunching of the figures is in a report by Curtin University for the first annual information statement. Australian Charities Involved Overseas is a satellite of that Curtin report that particularly focuses in on charities who are operating overseas. So I hope that gives you a general overview, and now my colleagues from other government departments will drill down into some of the details. Thanks very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Murray.